Hi everyone, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and I hope that you're doing well. I'd like to share a few thoughts about A Mercy by Toni Morrison. This is really the masterpiece of her later novels, and it is a book in which Morrison marshaled all of her talents as a writer, her skill with sensory language, her skill at writing stream of consciousness, the deep humanity and love that she invests in characters, to create a marvelous novel with an incredibly unique voice at its heart, but a novel that is confronting myths. It's confronting myths around the founding of the United States of America and what life was like in the colonies in a century before the American Revolution. It's a novel that is confronting myths around slavery and the deep horror that lay at the heart of that and the legacy of slavery. It's also a book that confronts, I think, myths around the tradition of the great American novel, a tradition that I think at this point Morrison was careful to note had included myths around her own novels and reactions to her novels in The Bluest Eye and Beloved in particular. But at its heart, it's just an incredible book because we have the voice of Florence, a young woman who is a slave, and her experiences. And this is how she opens. "Don't be afraid. My telling can't hurt you in spite of what I have done. And I promise to lie quietly in the dark, weeping perhaps, or occasionally seeing the blood once more. But I will never again unfold my limbs to rise up and bare teeth. I explain. You can think what I tell you a confession if you like, but one full of curiosities, familiar only in dreams." And the book goes on from there. And throughout, we're given moments and pages of that first-person consciousness, that deep, enigmatic voice from Florence. On the first page, there are little clues, shades in the corners of the first page that point towards what happened. Why is Florence sharing this narrative, this confession, if we want to call it that? But it's going to take the entire length of the novel to really grasp in all of its shattering understanding what has happened to her and why is she sharing this confession with us. But Morrison doesn't just give us that voice. That alone would have made this, I think, the masterpiece of her later novels. Rather, she includes this chorus of almost like short story episodes that are linked together, revealing the voices of each of the other characters whose lives have intersected with Florence. And so we have a young woman, as I said, living in the end of the 17th century here in the US, in the colonies, and she is a slave. And she's sold at the very beginning to a man who lives in what would become New York. And he's Dutch. And she goes with him to, work on this farm, this homestead he has. And so we get his voice and we find out what is driving this man. And that, I think, is one of the ways in which Morrison is sort of rewriting the tradition of the great American novel, because there's some way in which Jacob van Wart really reflects Thomas Sutpen from Faulkner's Absalom. And the way in which Florence's narrative is shared, her voice in some ways reflects the first-person narratives and the stream of consciousness from Faulkner's As I Lay Dying. And so Morrison is fusing those traditions to reveal that perhaps what we shouldn't be caring about is the great, self-made businessman, a man of commerce, man of means who builds his grand house. And of course, it's his tragedy when things don't work out, when his legacy isn't perpetuated, or when he suffers a business misfortune or something, that it's his tragedy, and that is the great tragedy, of the great American novel. And what Morrison is confronting is that the lives of all of those around that so-called great man, they are worthy, their voices are worthy, and those are the voices, again, that we get throughout this book. We see what is it like to be that man's wife. We get Rebecca's voice. What is it like to be one of his slaves? To be Lena, and the humanity, the wisdom in each of those voices is so vital to this book. For example, that was Lena, or was it God? Here in an abyss of loss, she wondered if the journey to this land, the dying off of her family, her whole life in fact, were way stations marking a road to revelation, or perdition. How would she know? And now, with death's lips calling her name, to whom should she turn? A blacksmith, Florence? How long will it take? Will he be there? Will she get lost? Will someone assault her? Will she return? Will he? And is it already too late for salvation? But what is the salvation there? Is it this physical salvation? Is it the salvation of, again, this family's legacy and its dream, this great house that's been built, and the farm that was beginning to, produce? Or is it an inner salvation, this salvation of the self, of the mind, of the heart, Can a person who has been enslaved legally and does not have the rights that the other characters have, can that person still have a mind and a spirit that are unshackled and that can burst free? And that's what Morrison is exploring throughout these pages. But she shows, as she gives the humanity in each of these voices and these characters, there's an incredible one with Sorrow, who has been a slave as well, and has lost a child. And then how does she relate to the other? She's almost viewed as other in many ways by the other characters. She has this character that she calls Twin, that she seems to speak to and commune to, but notably, nobody else ever interacts with this person. But Sorrow is perceptive, and she notices there had always been tangled strings among them. Now they were cut. Each woman embargoed herself, spun her own web of thoughts, unavailable to anyone else. It was as though they were falling away from one another. And so each character has these perceptions around human relationships. And what Morrison's very careful to do is to focus on these women, the experiences of these women. It is not primarily a book about a man finding his path and carving out his space here in the frontier of the Americas. It's rather about a group of women who go and plow and cut out, farm and take care of livestock and rescue each other when one gets sick. And how do they live? What are their lives like? What are their experiences like? But throughout the book, we continue to be, in a very real sense, haunted by the experiences of Florence. Because, as I had mentioned, this is a book in which Morrison was, I think, responding to ideas that had already gathered and the discourse that was arising around Beloved. It's important to note that by the time this book was published, Beloved had been recognized in the U.S. as the most important work of fiction between 1980 and 2005. And this was published about 3 years later. And so I think Morrison was kind of crafting ideas around, okay, there are people who say they like or don't like Beloved for various reasons. Well, let's revisit those ideas around slavery, around the experience of a mother who is a slave, and what her experiences are with her children. What does it mean to love your children knowing that they're growing into the future and the horrors that you're experiencing, and the truly specific horrors for a woman, including sexual violence. And so Morrison wants to confront that. And so Florence's narrative and her voice is incredibly haunting, because right from the beginning we're told that, she was essentially pushed off by her mother to be sold in place of her mother from the current slave plantation they'd been on to this Dutchman who was heading up to New York. And so she feels this abandonment, and she's constantly has this internal voice around, why was I the one who was abandoned? Why was I the one who was pushed out? And really what Morrison is examining throughout the book is this idea that characters get second chances. Many of them get second chances. They have a chance to do something, or they are, ensnared, in some cases in the bondage of slavery, in other cases ensnared by the economic, the lack of economic freedom that women would have in the 1680s in the colonies, or elsewhere, frankly, in Europe, or Jacob Van Barton, the way he's ensnared in business deals he's made, or ethical or unethical business deals he's been making. And so each of them, in some ways, gets some perhaps second chance, some moment to become a parent again, to make a better choice, a more humane or generous choice. And what Morrison wants to see is what happens when you don't perhaps feel like you've received the second chance. What happens when you get that second chance, but you're so haunted and bound to what happened in your past that perhaps you don't feel like that you can make a different choice from what you've made in the past. And that meditation on freedom that is legal, but also the freedom of the mind and the spirit, is something that is threaded through across here very explicitly in the voices of the characters. They once had thought they were a kind of family because together they had carved companionship out of isolation. But the family they imagined they had become was false. Whatever each one loved, sought, or escaped, their futures were separate and anyone's guess. One thing was certain: courage alone would not be enough. Minus bloodlines, he saw nothing yet on the horizon to unite them. Nevertheless, remembering how the curate described what existed before creation, Scully saw dark matter out there, thick, unknowable, aching to be made into a world. And that is the world Morrison has conjured for her readers in all of her novels, but particularly in this truly incredible masterpiece. This was published in 2008, and it was right after I'd graduated from college and had been digging into reading, a huge number of writers from the U.S., but throughout the 20th century and really throughout, classical canonical literature. And I had encountered her works, and so this was sort of the first one I was reading as it was published, and was just, I remember being blown away initially and still returning to it, 15 years later. It holds just as much power and just as much just dazzling beauty of language, the way that nature is described, and the way you feel the mud sucking at characters' shoes. So this is an incredible book. Please read it if you have not. As I had mentioned, it really is a book that is, I think, almost providing a counter-myth to Beloved, almost comparable to what Richard Wright was doing with Native Son when he, looked at how readers had reacted to Uncle Tom's Children. He wanted to sort of take a similar theme and take it in a different direction. But Beloved, I think, is the masterpiece of masterpieces among all of her novels and among all U.S. novels. It also, I think, really examines the fragility of women and of girls and of adolescent women that she had explored in The Bluest Eye. Love, a preceding novel, was really, I think, the first time that Morrison started going back and revisiting her earlier works, trying to work through new themes. I think this one in particular was working with Sula and The Bluest Eye. And then to read the actual slave narratives, the nonfiction, whether it's Harriet Jacobs, or the Sojourner Truth, Frederick Douglass, any of the slave narratives that did come down, that the freed slaves or those still in bondage were able to write down and share. These voices are vital, are absolutely critical to understanding what was happening there. And I had mentioned, of course, that I think their aspects of Florence narrative feels so close to what was happening in As I Lay Dying by Faulkner. The way that the book is really examining another side of that self-made person in the U.S. Gets at what was happening in Absalom. There are moments with a bear, and the way in which the characters each sort of have their own voice and have almost this short story narrative feels close to what was happening in Go Down Moses. So I think this was perhaps the most explicitly Faulkner-esque of Morrison's novels, but she very much made it her own. To read about a contemporary time period and look not just in what became the U.S., but also throughout the American continents. Memory of Fire, the great trilogy from Eduardo Galeano, and a more hysterically realistic and ultra-ironic take on the 17th century would be Argall by William T. Vollmann. Perhaps Terrence Malick's The New World tries to get at some of the poetry and beauty of nature that Morrison was exploring, although obviously moves in a very different direction as well. But let me know what you think. Let me know if you've read this one. Let me know what your favorite novel is from Toni Morrison. And I don't know, I may be revisiting Beloved at the end of this year. So I hope everybody's doing well. Thank you.